FedEx, go around. FedEx, go around.
Is that for FedEx? Bridge Tower, FedEx 49.
FedEx 49 Heavy, go around.
Going around FedEx 49.
Airport 10 Tower.
Roger, sir. Are you planning to evacuate the tower?
Airport 10, we're just inspecting it now. It looks as part of ceilings coming down and our equipment's everywhere. Foothills 4 Tower.
Foothills 4, man.
Foothills 4, we're going to evacuate the tower. We need to get it inspected. So we're going to be closing up. If you want a taxi back, I can get you moving back.
Yeah, I guess we can repo back to our hangar. How long a timeline are we looking at?
I'm not sure Foothills 4, but we're closing up here.
40 Delta, tower's going to close. You're on your own on Lake Hood. Treated the CTAP over there.
And that audio gives me chills. You're listening to audio from Live ATC Net moments after the earthquake hit the Anchorage, Alaska area. Of course, that's audio from the tower. Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 88 of Aviation News Talk Podcast, where we bring you general aviation news and safety tips that pilots and student pilots like you can use. Today, we're talking in detail about 4 things you should know about carbon monoxide poisoning and carbon monoxide monitors. Plus, this week in the news, we'll tell you where controllers had to briefly work after an earthquake hit Anchorage, Alaska, and they evacuated their tower. And pilots in a Cessna 206 were so desperate to climb, they began throwing luggage from the aircraft. And finally, we have the tale of a whale who was saved by GA pilots here in Northern California. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Trescott. I'm here to educate and inform you and hopefully have a little fun along the way. If you're new to the show, I've been a pilot for over 40 years. I'm the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. These days, I specialize in Cirrus aircraft like the SR20, SR22, and SF50 Vision Jet. So if you're starting to think that maybe one day you might want to buy one of those or learn to fly one, call me now. Free consultation and possibly a free demo flight as well. Hey, last week in episode 87, we talked with air traffic controller Phil Ennis about how he used a rather innovative way to help save a doctor who had a complete electrical failure while IFR in the dark. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. All this and more, and the news starts now. From alaskapublic.org, the 12-story air traffic control tower at Anchorage's main airport is normally one of the best offices in town with sweeping views of Denali and the local mountains. But on Friday morning last week, Anchorage's 7.0 earthquake reminded controllers that their workplace rests atop a 150-foot toothpick, said Clint Blazek, the supervisor in the tower. After evacuating, controllers first headed for their backup location, the airport fire station. But that building was closed to them too because of possible damage. So Blazek and 2 colleagues went out with Plan C. They guided in planes at the nation's 5th busiest cargo hub from the cab of a pickup truck at one end of the north-south runways. Their improvised response, with help from some quick-moving runway inspectors, meant the airport's 3 runways were closed for less than 10 minutes. Officials said, "Most of our equipment is windows, and we had a window in the truck," Blazek said in an interview on Saturday. He said everybody had a radio, everybody had a phone. Alaska Airlines diverted just 2 planes, one to Fairbanks and one that returned to Portland, and canceled just 4 flights that day. Damage to the airport's terminal did disrupt passenger traffic somewhat, and Alaska Airlines had to pause its operation for a safety check. But cargo traffic moved largely unabated, according to aircraft officials. Now, back in 1964, when Anchorage had a much larger earthquake, the tower there actually collapsed and 1 controller died. This time, Blazek said the building swayed 3 or 4 feet, and he described watching transformers blow out around town during the pre-dawn earthquake. A coffee pot was knocked from its perch, and even Saturday morning, that platform was still missing some ceiling tiles. In a break room 1 floor down, 1 controller put a pillow over his head as a locker tipped over, a fire extinguisher ripped off the wall, and a refrigerator rocked halfway across the room. It was just stuff everywhere, the contents of everything just thrown all over the floor, according to the controller. Immediately after the quake, tower controllers aborted an imminent landing by a FedEx jet. And once the magnitude of the earthquake became clear, controllers all evacuated. Blazek headed down the spiral staircase from the observation deck carrying a pair of radios. The airport's 3 runways needed to be inspected for cracks before they could reopen, which took about 8 minutes. They say working from a truck isn't completely unprecedented. Controllers sometimes operate from trucks or tents or trailers during emergencies. The Seattle airport built a temporary tower out of shipping containers after a 2001 earthquake destroyed their previous tower. The job demands a certain amount of improvisation, according to a local Anchorage aviation professor. In the aftermath of the earthquake, Blazek said controllers are reassessing their backup plans, given that their original Plan B, the fire station, turned out to be inaccessible. And I want to thank listener John in Iowa for sending along information about a recent crash that occurred near him in Iowa and his suggestion that it might make a good topic to discuss here. I'm looking at a Des Moines Register article from November 12, 2018, describes the crash as it was first reported. It says, 4 people were killed in a plane crash Friday in Guthrie County after the pilot had a heart attack, the deadliest aviation incident in Iowa since 2007. Sheriff's office was called at 5 p.m. from Des Moines Air Traffic Control requesting an emergency landing for a single-engine aircraft at the airport east of Guthrie Center. The plane, a 1975 Piper Dakota, never arrived. Air Traffic Control told local authorities the pilot, Edward Ralph Anderson of Lamar's, suffered a heart attack and that a student pilot would attempt an emergency landing of the plane, which had 2 additional passengers. The plane left Lamar's in northwest Iowa at 4:15 p.m. and was traveling to Osceola, Guthrie County. Air Traffic Control reported the aircraft disappearing from radar about 4 miles southwest of the airport. More than 13 hours later, on Saturday morning, a resident reported a small plane crash in a cow pasture southwest of the intersection of 265th Street and Maple Avenue in Guthrie County. In a brief interview, the pilot's father, James Anderson, said his son was a pilot for more than 15 years, and he was flying the 3 people on a hunting trip. Now, here's the follow-up story that appeared 5 days later in the Omaha World Herald. It says preliminary autopsy results show that 4 people who died in a small plane crash in central Iowa earlier this month were suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning. TV station KCCI reported that the Iowa State Medical Examiner's Office said that all victims died from multiple blunt force injuries in the setting of carbon monoxide toxicity. Now, John said in his original email to me, quote, the speculation now is that the pilot may have succumbed to it first, with the student pilot passenger later. Scary stuff, and as a pilot, it certainly has some lessons that can be learned. Unfortunately, they aren't new lessons. And of course, we'll be talking in more detail about carbon monoxide poisoning later in this show. From thedailywire.com, 2 Utah teens steal an aircraft on Thanksgiving and successfully land before being arrested. While most teens were recovering from a turkey coma and spending time with loved ones, a 14-year-old and a 15-year-old in northeast Utah stole a small plane on Thanksgiving and took it for a short flight before safely landing it and being arrested. The single-engine prop plane was stolen from a private airstrip in Jensen, according to a statement the sheriff's office posted on Facebook. Quote, this morning the teens gained access to a tractor and drove it to the airstrip in Jensen, where they stole a fixed-wing single-engine light sport aircraft. They said the plane was witnessed flying very low along US 40 near Gusher, about 32 miles west of Jensen. The statement added that the boys were planning on flying more west to Wasatch Front, but instead turned around and landed at the Vernal Regional Airport, about 15 miles from where they became airborne. According to Reuters, the teens live in a group home in the Wasatch Front, a metropolitan region, including the state capital, Salt Lake City. The sheriff's office said they were visiting friends in Jensen. Both teens are reportedly being held at the Split Mountain Youth Detention Center in Vernal on multiple charges. The names of the teens have not been released due to them both being minors. There is no word on how the boys learned how to fly an aircraft, and that's quite remarkable. At that age, I would have thought that this would have been a fatal crash. From AINonline.com, half of U.S. aircraft fleet will miss the ADS-B deadline. Just 46.2% of the U.S. aircraft fleet is projected to meet the ADS-B equipment mandate by January 1, 2020 deadline, according to a panel of business aviation industry experts. With just over 400 days left, only 30.3% of the fleet is equipped, according to FAA data as of November 1st. But on the general aviation side, the equipage figure is bleaker. 22.2% according to data compiled by JetNet and Duncan Aviation. Business jet equipage was highest with 7,477 aircraft, or 52.5% of aircraft now equipped and ADS-B compliant. According to this, turboprops are 29% compliant, helicopters 14.2%, and pistons 17.5%. Panelist Alex Craig said you'll be effectively grounded after January 1, 2020. He says book a slot now if you haven't already. They said the slots are already in short supply, noting that Duncan Aviation has informed existing customers that it might not have enough capacity to cover all of them by the deadline. From iPadPilot.news, ForeFlight now supports synthetic vision on the iPhone. ForeFlight just released version 10.5, and it adds a few highly sought-after features. Most notably, the update brings synthetic vision to the iPhone. Of course, that's been available on the iPad version in the past. And this article says we've heard many requests from pilots for this feature so they can run a backup attitude on their iPhone while saving valuable real estate on their tablet screen for aviation maps, charts, and other critical flight information. As with the synthetic information on the iPad, once paired with an AHRS-capable ADS-B receiver like Stratus, dynamic pitch and bank visualization become available. 3D traffic targets will also be visible while connected with a compatible ADS-B receiver. The iPhone also supports glance mode, allowing you to swipe within synthetic vision to view terrain and traffic in any direction. And it notes it requires at least an iPhone 6 or newer, as there's no support for smaller phones like the iPhone 5, 5S, and SE. Another limitation on the iPhone is that there are no airspeed or altitude tapes, but you can still overlay the instrument readouts at the bottom of the screen if desired. Synthetic vision on iPad or iPhone requires a Pro Plus level subscription from ForeFlight. From aeronews.net, the FAA is accepting applications from experienced controllers. If you're an experienced air traffic controller who would like to join the FAA, the agency is now accepting applications nationwide through December 9th, 2018. Applicants must be willing to work at any FAA ATC facility and may be required to attend specialized training at the FAA Academy in Oklahoma City. Active duty service members will receive tentative veterans preference if they submit a document from the Armed Forces certifying that within 120 days they are expected to be discharged or released from active duty service under honorable conditions, and their application shows that they have the required service. Veterans on terminal leave must provide documentation certifying authorized terminal leave. Following are the qualifications for experienced controllers. You must have U.S. citizenship. You cannot be older than 35, though they say there are some special exceptions. The announcement is open to candidates who have maintained at least 52 consecutive weeks of air traffic control experience involving the full-time active separation of air traffic. The candidate must have an air traffic control certification or facility rating within 5 years prior to application while serving at any of the following: an FAA air traffic control facility, a civilian or military air traffic control facility for the Department of Defense, or a tower operating under contract with the FAA under Section 47-124. And you can apply through usajobs.gov, and I'll include a link in our show notes for that link. In international news, this comes from flyer.co.uk, that's Flyer magazine. SkyDemon to display glider FLARM signals. Now, this will be of interest to mostly European listeners. Users of SkyDemon, which I understand is the most popular electronic flight bag app in Europe at this point, will shortly be able to display signals broadcast by FLARM, that's FLARM, equipped gliders using a SkyEcho 2 ADS-B receiver. And just to explain, if you're a glider pilot, you've probably already heard of FLARM. It's a traffic awareness and collision avoidance technology for GA light aircraft. It's used a lot in Europe, and especially within gliders, as I understand. According to the research I've done here, over 35,000 aircraft and many UAVs are currently equipped with FLARM. But back to this story, Tim Dawson, who's the boss at SkyDemon, says, our agreement means that SkyEcho 2 can receive the FLARM signals and pass them to SkyDemon in their raw form. We then decode them and feed the telemetry from the FLARM aircraft into our normal collision avoidance algorithms. As a pilot, you won't need to know or care whether it's an ADS-B or a FLARM signal that's been received. You'll just be warned about any conflict. With a good proportion of the glider fleet throughout Europe emitting FLARM signals, we want to be able to receive these signals and avoid getting too close to one. The add-on will cost SkyDemon users about £30 extra a year, most of which goes to FLARM for licensing the technology. UAvionics, the manufacturer of the SkyEcho ADS-B device, will start delivering the Echo 2 device carrying FLARM capability within a few weeks. Existing devices will be upgraded with a firmware download at no cost, and the next version of SkyDemon will contain the FLARM decoding ability. From Bulawalo24.com, that's a website I believe in Africa somewhere, Zimbabwe aircraft crash victims threw luggage overboard. The 5 people who were traveling in the doomed Cessna 206, which crashed in the Renko area of Masvingo South last week, desperately tried to save the doomed aircraft minutes before the disaster. Sources told the Telzim News that recordings of the plane's black box, which is kind of unusual. I wouldn't have thought a 206 would have a black box. But anyway, they say the recordings show that the pilots and its 4 passengers threw their luggage overboard as indications that the plane had developed mechanical problems became apparent. They started to throw their luggage off after realizing their plane was struggling. The plane crashed a few minutes after takeoff from Buffalo Range Airport. All people on board, 2 people from Zimbabwe and 3 Finns, died in the crash. Now, this reminded me of an accident that occurred here in California, and I went and looked it up. And sure enough, back in August of 1997, Piper Saratoga departed from San Jose, California at about 11:30 in the morning. Now, you've got to know that San Jose is near sea level and has relatively cool temperatures. A couple of hours later, the plane and its 3 passengers attempted to land at Hesperia, California. Now, that's down in Southern California in the high desert region. And I looked it up. The temperature at the time at that airport was 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And the accident report says, following a go-around in high-density altitude conditions, the plane was observed to enter a shallow climb, then turned approximately 20 degrees to the right and followed a wide depression in the surrounding terrain without any noticeable gain in altitude. While following this depression, 3 pieces of luggage were observed being thrown from the right side of the aircraft. The plane then hit power lines and crashed. The pilot was 21 years old with 272 hours of total time. The probable cause of that accident was failure of the pilot to see and avoid high-voltage power lines while coping with a lack of engine power during a go-around in high-density altitude conditions. And I couldn't help but wonder if perhaps that aircraft in Zimbabwe may have also been facing high-density altitude issues. And we've got 2 animal stories here today. First comes from the Summit Daily. That's a newspaper in Colorado. It says that Parks and Wildlife searches for a pilot harassing wildlife near Craig. Officials with Colorado Parks and Wildlife are asking the public for help in identifying a pilot responsible for harassing a large herd of elk near Craig last month. On November 16th, several witnesses reported seeing a single-engine aircraft make 2 low passes over the herd, disturbing the animals and causing them to scatter. Wildlife officers with Parks and Wildlife are taking the opportunity to remind the public that using aircraft to harass wildlife or aid in hunting is a violation of Colorado's wildlife laws and Federal Airborne Hunting Act. So far, they say the only information they have about the incident is the plane was either white or yellow in color and was a single-engine aircraft with a low-wing design. Evan Jones of CPW noted that wildlife officers receive several reports of low-flying aircraft during hunting season each year, and that individuals who spot similar incidents should try and note the aircraft's tail number or catch video of the aircraft. And finally, just to show you how far and wide I hunt for interesting stories, this comes from marinelifestudies.org, and it's the tale of that whale that was caught in crab gear here in Santa Cruz, California. An adult humpback whale entangled in Oregon Dungeness crab gear was spotted by the Half Moon Bay Pilots Association on Friday, just outside of Half Moon Bay near Pigeon Point. The pilots documented the entanglement with photographs and notified NOAA's Large Whale Entanglement Response Program. On Saturday, the local Pilots Association put up another airplane to see if they could spot the entangled whale, while teams stood by in Half Moon Bay waiting for the opportunity to respond. The Cascadia Research Collective, that's the CRC, their members were on their vessel, the Musculus, when they learned about the entanglement on Friday. They searched the area on Saturday but did not relocate the whale. Unfortunately, since the whale was not resighted, the teams had to stand down. On Sunday morning, CRC members headed to the shelf edge for a 150-mile-long survey with Stanford personnel. Surprisingly, the first whale they came across was that same entangled whale. They stood by and waited until WET, the whale entanglement team from Moss Landing, was able to provide assistance with an inflatable boat to help document the severity of the entanglement. A local fisherman out of Half Moon Bay volunteered his time in the vessel Aqua Hero to help out for the day. A member of the CWR later met the team to assist. The team was able to remove approximately 350 feet of the trailing line before daylight was lost, and then they attached a telemetry buoy to the trailing gear to aid in relocating the whale the following day. On Monday, the WET crew returned to Half Moon Bay and set out to relocate the entangled humpback via the satellite signals from the telemetry buoy. The U.S. Coast Guard initially located the whale and stood by until the response teams arrived and removed almost all of the remaining gear. The team was unable to remove all of the gear from the whale because of several tight wraps of line embedded deep into the tail. They were able to cut close to the embedded lines, hoping it will become loose as the whale begins to swim in a normal condition. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up, we're going to talk about carbon monoxide and what you can do to prevent from becoming a victim of this silent killer. Stick around. We'll be back right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And before we get to our main topic about carbon monoxide poisoning, let me give you a few brief updates here. Now, this has been a busy 2 weeks for me. I have had about 5 new people starting training with me, which is a lot. One of them is a student pilot who just bought an SR20. Another's a newly licensed private who's working on an instrument rating in an SR20 while he continues to think about whether or not to buy a new SR22. Third one has almost finished as a student pilot, but he had to stop training for about a year. Now, he was training in the 172, but he decided he wants to go ahead and finish up the Cirrus SR20. We've got a fourth pilot who hasn't flown in about 12 years and wants to get current and get his IFR in his Cirrus. And the fifth one is somebody who works at Google who's interested in getting his private in the Cirrus. And, of course, it's not going to be confusing at all because several of them are named Dan. I don't know how I keep all these things straight. But the best part of last week was I got to fly in a new Cirrus SF50 Vision Jet. Haven't been in one for almost 2 months, and holy cow, is it easy to forget over that time frame. So I spent a couple of hours reviewing the night before I climbed into it, because even though I nailed the oral when I did my type rating check ride back in mid-September, I knew I had forgotten a lot already. So I was flying with a Vision Jet pilot who's got about 85 hours in type. We went through a lot of rain, and we picked up some trace amounts of ice, but the plane performed extremely well throughout our flight up to Oregon and back. And it looks like I've got a few more flights scheduled in the SF50 Vision Jet over the next 2 months, so I'm really looking forward to those. Now, for pilots who live here in California, especially those up in Northern California who sometimes fly in the San Francisco Bay Area, you'll be happy to hear that I've updated my Bay Tour map. Now, anybody who flies in this area knows what the Bay Tour is. That's a series of routes that people can fly in and under and around the Class Bravo, sometimes through the Class Bravo. And it takes you up to where you can do a lot of great sightseeing over Alcatraz, the Golden Gate Bridge, and some of the fun things to see up there. And it's been a long time since I've updated this map. I first released it over 14 years ago. I'm not sure exactly when I released it, and there have probably been over 1,000 people who have purchased that from local stores. And the reason I originally did it was that I was kind of surprised that people would come to me and ask me to teach them how to fly the Bay Tour. And I kind of thought, well, gee, you can figure out a lot of that if you just read the San Francisco terminal area chart. But then I realized, yep, you're going to spend a whole lot of time doing that. You're going to need to be very careful and look for a lot of little hidden details because the airspace is relatively complicated. So that's why I put together the map to help explain to people much of what I would teach them if they were to fly with me in the air to learn about the Bay Tour. Now, the reason for the major update is that our Class Bravo changed back in August. As a result, there have been a few changes to the San Francisco Bay Tour route as well. So the maps are just a single laminated sheet of a heavily marked up San Francisco Bay Area terminal chart. And on the backside are detailed write-ups telling you how to request a Bay Tour from any of the major airports here in the San Francisco Bay Area, as well as the common arrival and departure procedures for all those airports. So if you want a copy of this map, just contact me, or they're going to be back in stock again real quickly at the pilot shop at Reed Hillview Airport or at the pilot shop in San Carlos. And the maps are $15 a piece. And hey, quick mention on the second annual listener survey. Thanks so much to everybody who has filled that out already. If you haven't, please go ahead and give me your feedback. This is your chance to help guide changes to the show as we think about what topics to cover and, things to add and subtract from the format of the show. So if there's one little thing I do each week that drives you crazy, let me know. Just take the survey. Go out to aviationnewstalk.com/survey. And if you really love the show and you're looking for just a little bit more after you get done, head on out to our Patreon page. For example, our Patreon sponsors were among the first to learn about the whale story, which I posted on the Patreon site several days ago. Now, anybody could cruise on out to that site and read that post for free along with all the other posts there. But if you're a Patreon member, well, you're going to get an email once or twice a week with these special stories. And not only that, if you donate at the $8 a month level, well, you're going to have access to our complete list of all the stories that didn't make this show. Now, in this show, we had 12 news stories that we covered, but 13 stories didn't make it. And just to give you a little idea of what those 13 stories include, there's a story here on the first kit plane to be sold in China. There's a story about a lawsuit over a Cessna crash that was the result of a drill bit being left inside of a critical part of that aircraft. There's a story about a pilot in England who was depressed and unfortunately decided that having depression was going to prevent him from pursuing his career. So he ended his life, unfortunately. We've got stories about the first Royal Flying Doctors service down in Australia's new PC-24 jet. We've got stories about a 95-year-old World War II pilot who at that age is still doing angel flights but was looking to raise money to replace an HSI in his aircraft. Got stories on a modified 737 that's fighting fires. an 80th anniversary book from AOPA, and lots and lots and lots of other stories. So go on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Take a look at the website, and if you choose to donate, hey, we'd greatly appreciate it. And let me tell you about our new Patreon supporters. Chuck Grindle updated his pledge to $8, so he can now see all those news stories that don't make it onto the show. Glenn Neeson edited his pledge up to $20. Thank you much, Glenn. Eric Chadwick edited his pledge up to $8, and Kilted Piper joined us as a sponsor. And since this is the first show of the month, I'm going to read our super supporters, folks that donate more than $20 a month. Thanks to Jeremy Zawadny, Peter Long, Seth Lake, Jason Blair, who we've had on the show, Joseph Haggerty, Michael Rogers, Michael Spain, Larry Noe, Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation, Roger Griggs, Chuck Price, Don Dillman, Stella Sue, Jonathan Weisswasser, Jim Barrett, Fabio Kamlos, Lance Fletcher, Joseph Morales, Moj Kazi, Tyson Weiss, Adam Nunn, Chris Carnahan, Anthony Pitt, Jeffrey Bell, David DeCurtis, Edward Varso, Antoine Hanekom, Jack Downey, Paul Peterson, and a couple new people, Peter Alberti, who has the CFIskills.com website to help CFIs deliver world-class training to aviation students, and Glenn Neeson, who's a software guy who's working on his instrument and commercial ratings. I want to really thank you for all of your contributions and for everyone who helps support the show in any way. And now in a moment, we're going to talk about carbon monoxide poisoning here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. You know, it's rare that I have a topic that applies to just about 100% of all pilots, but carbon monoxide poisoning is something that can happen to just about any pilot in any aircraft. Now, the FAA has a brochure on carbon monoxide poisoning, and if you have our free Aviation News Talk app that you can find in your phone's app store, I've already uploaded this brochure, and you'll find it in the app under the PDF tab. The brochure says in part that, quote, carbon monoxide poisoning is a safety issue that pilots tend to ignore, even though it is the most common industrial poisoning accident in the United States. When carbon monoxide poisoning occurs, it can have significant and fatal consequences for people in the plane. Carbon monoxide is truly a hidden menace because by itself it is both a colorless and odorless gas. Fortunately, because it's a byproduct of combustion, carbon monoxide is frequently associated with other gases that do have an odor and color. The true problem comes when exposure is so gradual that you don't perceive it. You can become incapacitated before you can vacate the environment. In an airplane, the result most likely will be a fatal accident. So let's talk about my 4 important things to know about carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, the first one is to recognize the symptoms. Common symptoms of CO poisoning include headache, dizziness, weakness, confusion, upset stomach, vomiting, and chest pain. Also, your skin color can either be pink or pale and your lips bright red. You also might pass out or die from breathing in too much of the gas. People who are sleeping or drunk can die of carbon monoxide poisoning before they even have symptoms, according to the U.S. Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention. Now, number 2, the most common source of CO in planes is a faulty heating system. So if you suspect CO poisoning, shut off the cabin heat, open the windows to bring in fresh air, and land as soon as possible. Number 3, 43% of poison patients still have cognitive problems a year after their encounter. Wow. So that tells you right there you really don't want to have a CO encounter, or you want to make it very brief. And finally, number 4, get an electronic CO detector. Now, this is the perfect Christmas gift for any pilot, so treat yourself to this potentially life-saving device. And I'll talk about 2 models you can order later in the segment. Now, you may wonder how frequently carbon monoxide accidents occur. Back in 2003, Mike Bush, who we just had on the show here back in May, wrote an article on avweb.com about carbon monoxide poisoning, and he produced a list of accidents that averaged about 1 accident per year. And earlier today, I searched the NTSB database to see how many of these kinds of accidents I could find. And I didn't want to miss an accident, so I did a pretty broad search on just the word carbon, just to make sure I wouldn't miss any. And I picked the year 2016, figuring that the final reports would now be in for almost any of the accidents that occurred that year. Well, the search turned up 124 accidents with the word carbon, and I went through all 124 of them to find which ones were caused by carbon monoxide poisoning. Many of the reports said that the pilot tested negative for carbon monoxide poisoning, so we could eliminate those, but nearly as many reports said that carbon monoxide testing had not been performed. So there's a possibility that there are more accidents related to carbon monoxide poisoning than the NTSB reports indicate. There were also several accidents in which CO was detected in the pilot's body, but there'd been a fire on board, and the CO there was most likely inhaled by the pilots and hence wasn't the cause of the accident. There were also some references to carbon cub or carbon deposits in the engine, and after going through all 124 accidents, I found 2 that were a direct result of carbon monoxide poisoning. But there were certainly just as many carbon monoxide incidents that didn't result in an accident because the pilots realized that there was a problem, opened the windows to get fresh air, and I'll talk about some of those near misses with carbon monoxide in a moment. But first, let's talk about the 2 accidents I found from 2016. Both were fatal. One was in March of that year in Ellsworth, Nebraska in Naranka. The private pilot departed for a local personal flight on a winter day with an outside air temperature of about 60 degrees C. That's going to be around 43 degrees Fahrenheit. About 1 hour after takeoff, the pilot's brother saw the plane maneuvering near his home, which was in a rural area. The airplane did not return to the departure airport, and the accident site was located in an open field 2 days later, about 4 miles from the pilot's brother's home. Examination of the accident site revealed wreckage and impact signatures consistent with the pilot losing control of the airplane. Examination of the engine's exhaust muffler revealed cracks in several locations, and the muffler's shroud contained a layer of exhaust residue. 6 months before the accident, the pilot and the mechanic who had previously performed an annual inspection on the airplane became aware of a crack in the muffler near a weld that the pilot had performed. The pilot had purchased a replacement muffler, but it was not installed before the accident, and a carbon monoxide detector was not on board the airplane. Toxicology testing of the pilot's blood revealed a carbon monoxide level of 40%, which was more than enough to severely impair the pilot. Carbon monoxide likely entered the airplane's cabin because of the cracked engine exhaust muffler. The probable cause was the pilot's impairment due to carbon monoxide poisoning from a known cracked engine exhaust muffler, which resulted in a loss of aircraft control. Now, the second accident was in September 2016 in Alaska. It was in a hefty Polar Cub. Post-accident examination of the airplane's exhaust system revealed the muffler can assembly was cracked around most of its circumference near the inlet portion of the muffler, which would have allowed exhaust gases to enter the cabin. Toxicology tests revealed 48% carbon monoxide in the pilot's blood. Now, here's another accident that occurred in 2017. This was February 2017 with a Mooney M20C in Ellendale, Minnesota. The accident occurred during the commercial pilot's third flight of the day. The pilot reported that he'd used the airplane's heater throughout the day. The pilot reported having a headache and experienced butterflies in his stomach during the end of the first flight. The headache subsided after the flight, and he felt fine during the second flight, but the headache returned after he landed. On the third flight, the pilot added that while taxiing to the runway, he still had the headache and he experienced another episode of butterflies. He stated that the symptoms were more intense at that time than they had been in the morning, but they subsided by the time he reached the runway, and he felt good but became hyper-focused. Soon after takeoff, the pilot passed out. ATC repeatedly attempted to contact the pilot without success. Radar data showed the airplane climbed higher than 12,000 feet and was off course. The plane continued to fly until it ran out of fuel and crashed in an open field. The pilot was not conscious until after the plane impacted the field. He stated he was very confused and had loud ringing in his ears at this point. He freed his legs from the wreckage and exited the airplane. He stated he was very weak and had difficulty with his balance and ability to walk as he made his way to a nearby house. A post-accident examination revealed that both fuel tanks were empty, the cabin heat was found on, and the engine vent control was found off. The exhaust muffler had several cracks, one of which contained soot exhaust deposits on the fractured surfaces indicated existed before impact. The crack would have allowed exhaust gases to enter the cockpit cabin. The pilot reported the airplane was not equipped with a carbon monoxide detector. The pilot's CO level, which was tested 4.5 hours after the accident, was 13.8%, given the half-life of CO in the bloodstream over 4 to 5 hours. While breathing ambient air, the pilot's CO level at the time of the accident was at least 28% and likely significantly higher because oxygen was administered in varying amounts during the first few hours of his medical care. Now, I'm sure there are many carbon monoxide near misses where a pilot takes corrective action before an accident occurs. So to try and figure out how many of those there are, I did a separate search of the NASA's ASRS database, and there were 79 reports that included the words carbon monoxide. Most of those, and this was kind of a surprise to me, were air carrier incidents. So apparently a lot of these things happen on airliners, and many of them involved flight attendants, often fires in the galley and things like that. But there were a number of GA incidents, and I'll read a portion of just a few of the GA incidents. One was a Piper Arrow in September 2017. The reporter wrote, "We later decided to work on touch and goes during the first 2 laps in the pattern. Every time I pulled the throttle idle, we would smell exhaust. We left the window open and decided to call it a night. On the 3rd and final landing of the night, when I pulled the throttle idle, the smell of exhaust was overwhelming and sickening. We taxied with the door, windows, and any source of fresh air open all the way to parking. I wasn't feeling very well when I exited the aircraft, so I walked over to the grass and dry heaved for about a minute. I ended up going to the hospital later that night to confirm what was making me feel weird. They drew my blood 3 hours after I got out of the plane, and when they gave me my test results back, my blood had 2% carbon monoxide. Turns out there was a tiny exhaust leak, and he says not even 1 millimeter in diameter in the heating shroud of the aircraft. By the way, 1 millimeter, that's about the width of a dime, so that's a pretty small hole." This report came from March 2017. It was Cessna 172. The reporter wrote, "Exhaust gas leak on board while conducting a biannual flight review. Upon entering left midfield downwind, I noticed the smell of exhaust fumes in the cockpit and requested a right turnout. Tower approved this turnout, and we headed toward XYZ Airport at 2,500 feet. Upon reaching 2,500, both pilot and I, who was the instructor, began feeling symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning. We slowed the aircraft down momentarily to open the window to get additional fresh air into the cockpit. We then proceeded to close the window so we could get our speed up to land at XYZ for a straight-in approach." And from July 2014, this was in an SR20, a Cirrus. The reporter wrote, "En route, after initial climb to 13,000 feet and setting cruise power, I began to feel disoriented, confused, nauseated, and groggy. I was using oxygen and checked my O2 saturation and found it to be 97%. However, my pulse was 130. I was concerned but not alarmed. However, I found that my fingertips and the end of my nose began to tingle and feel numb, and I became alarmed. Since my O2 saturation was good, I suspected CO effects from an exhaust leak and was concerned with my ability to continue the flight. Since I was feeling ill, I decided that the best decision was to land immediately. I was near an airport and notified ATC that I was declaring an emergency and began an emergency descent. I landed uneventfully 5 minutes later. Since I suspected CO poisoning, I left the plane there and hired an A&P to inspect the plane for exhaust leaks before returning to retrieve the plane. I continued my trip via commercial airline. Although I do not have proof, I strongly suspect an exhaust leak and CO poisoning, as the plane had backfired on the day previously, which was unusual. Knowing that a backfire could indicate an exhaust leak, I should have removed the cowling and closely inspected the plane before flying again. The long climb, flown rich of peak mixture, probably contributed to CO entering the cabin. Additionally, I have purchased a CO detector for use in the plane. And just to dig into that a little bit, the reporter said that a backfire could indicate an exhaust leak. I think that's probably a little inaccurate. Probably be more accurate to say that it could actually cause an exhaust leak. What I've read elsewhere is that backfires are extremely hard on exhaust systems, and they stress the entire system in a very abrupt and severe manner, and that can damage the baffles, possibly breaking them loose. And backfires can also bulge or crack the can. So anytime you have a backfire, it really warrants a thorough inspection of the entire exhaust system. And from March 2007, this is a Piper Seminole, which of course is a twin-engine aircraft. While working in the practice area with my student, I noticed my vision of the glass cockpit starting to get fuzzy. After this started, I also noticed I was getting a slight headache. I blame this on the fact that I've been wearing my contact lenses all day, and they've been known to do this, but I also started to watch myself for any further symptoms of hypoxia or carbon monoxide. While doing landings, my student complained of feeling dizziness, slightly sick, and a headache, and asked me if I could turn the heat down to see if cold air would make him feel better. I immediately realized that we were both experiencing symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning. I immediately turned off the heater and opened all the fresh air vents in the aircraft to full. We departed the area and returned to the airport as fast as possible and at low altitude to combat any further symptoms of hypoxia. Both of us felt better once the fresh air started flowing. I was glad that I had recognized the symptoms early enough that neither of us had severe symptoms and that we could return to the airport. Now, obviously, one common theme of these incidents is a faulty exhaust system that's letting carbon monoxide enter the heating system. And just to drill down on that for a moment and explain how that happens, let's talk about the cabin heat in a Cessna 172. Now, the way it works is that it's usually the heat exchanger, which is transferring heat from the engine exhaust pipe to a cold outside air. And this transfer heat warms the cold outside air so that you'll get warm air inside the cabin. But let me just describe what this looks like. like. Imagine first a long, straight pipe that brings exhaust gases away from the engine and vents them to the outside. Now imagine that you place that exhaust pipe inside another larger pipe. That larger pipe is sometimes called a shroud because it wraps around some portion of the inner pipe. Now the larger pipe has outside air passing through it. Cold air enters the shroud or the outer pipe, and then that air passes over the hot inner pipe that's carrying the exhaust gases. The hot inner pipe heats the cold air passing around it in the outer pipe. That heated air then gets sent to the cabin when you pull on the cabin heat knob. When this system works perfectly, the gases in the two pipes are completely isolated from each other. But these systems often have welds that can crack or may have been improperly done, or there may be a tiny hole that burns its way into the inner pipe. And any of those breaches can let exhaust gases and carbon monoxide move from the inner pipe to the outer pipe, where they are now free to enter the cabin. So that's why faulty exhaust systems are one of the main causes of carbon monoxide poisoning. Now let's talk about the symptoms of CO poisoning in detail. This list comes from the FAA brochure called Carbon Monoxide, A Deadly Menace, and I mentioned this brochure earlier, and this is what it says about carbon monoxide symptoms. It says if your percent of CO in the blood is less than 10%, typical symptoms are none. From 10 to 20%, it's going to be a slight headache. From 21 to 30% CO in your blood, you can expect headache, slight increase in respiration, and drowsiness. From 31 to 40%, you'll have headache, impaired judgment, shortness of breath, increased drowsiness, and blurring of vision. Now, this is where they show the red zone occurs above 40% of CO in your bloodstream. So from 41 to 50, they say pounding headache, confusion, marked shortness of breath, marked drowsiness, and increasingly blurred vision. And above 51% of carbon monoxide in your bloodstream, unconsciousness, eventual death, the victim is not removed from a source of CO. So just to repeat from earlier, if you experience any of these systems, you want to turn off the cabin heat, open the windows, and land as soon as practical. And if you have oxygen on board, obviously try and use that. Now I'm just going to read from something I wrote when I was a monthly columnist for EAA Sport Aviation magazine about 7 years ago. And I wrote, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, about 500 non-fire unintentional deaths occur each year from CO poisoning, making it the third leading cause of unintentional poisoning death in the U.S. In addition, at least 50,000 people a year survive encounters with CO poisoning, and 43% of poisoned patients still have cognitive problems a year after their encounter. And I want to underscore that point. That basically says nearly half of the people who get CO poisoning still have cognitive or problems with their thought process a year later. So this is really a serious ailment that you want to avoid. Although you can't see, smell, or taste it, carbon monoxide can make you sick or kill you. The problem is severe enough that the FAA tasked Wichita State University to investigate the problem and solutions. The resulting report, DOT FAA AR-09/49, Detection and Prevention of Carbon Monoxide Exposure in General Aviation Aircraft, includes an evaluation of 43 different CO detectors. According to the report, quote, the FAA standard for CO in an aircraft cabin is no more than 50 parts per million. However, there is currently no requirement to monitor for CO in the cabin. The report said characteristics that are important for GA applications include high accuracy, quick response time, inherent immunity to false alarms, and low power consumption, and it concluded that CO detectors using electrochemical sensors may be the most suitable for GA. Now, I did some evaluation of a unit that I borrowed from the manufacturer. It was called the Pocket CO300, and I was testing it to see if it met those characteristics. It can detect as little as 1 part per million of carbon monoxide, but doesn't sound an alarm until levels of 50, 125, or 400 parts per million are detected. These alarms are appropriate since Wichita State found that, quote, CO was detected on more than 90% of the flights monitored, either on the ground or in the air or both. But the majority of CO events detected were less than 10 parts per million, with a very small percentage of flights detecting levels above 50 parts per million. Now, a lot of pilots these days use cardboard chemical patch detectors that stick to the instrument panel. And these are very expensive, perhaps less than $10, but they do have some drawbacks. First, they don't detect low levels of carbon monoxide. Tests show that they take a couple of minutes of exposure to high levels of carbon monoxide in excess of 100 parts per million before they start to turn color. They also need to be replaced every few months, so unless a pilot is really diligent about changing them, he or she may get a false sense of security. By contrast, the Pocket CO300 uses an electrical chemical sensor containing hydrochloric acid. A voltage is applied to the acid, and the current flow is proportional to the amount of carbon monoxide present. One drawback is that the sensor slowly dries over time. After about a year, it could read as much as 10% lower, and KWJ Engineering offers a calibration kit that users can use to recalibrate their detectors. The kit includes an aerosol can and a plastic pouch that the Pocket CO300 is placed in. Air from the can, which includes 100 parts per million of carbon monoxide in the can, is sprayed into the pouch to expose the detector to a known concentration of CO. Now, Wichita State did analyze where to mount a CO detector and concluded that the instrument panel was the most effective location. Now, pilots could attach the Pocket CO300 to the panel via Velcro, but I'm guessing most pilots will want to leave it on a keychain or use the clip to attach it somewhere near the instrument panel. Now, I wrote that I like the CO300 because it weighs less than an ounce. It was so small that I clip it onto my shirt in flight and then promptly forget it's there. It could also be easily attached to a keychain, which would be a good place for pilots to carry it. However, as a flight instructor, my keys are usually in my pocket, so I store the CO300 with my headset so that I see it and am reminded to clip it on. Now, the only downside I've heard about the Pocket CO300 was that its 82 decibel buzzer isn't as loud as alarms in other detectors. The device does vibrate and flash when an alarm, so clipping it to your shirt assures that you won't miss an alarm. Now, I've looked it up, and that device is currently listed in Amazon for $163, and I've included a link in the show notes that you can easily order one if you'd like. Now, if you've also been thinking about maybe buying a portable ADS-B receiver, you might want to kill two birds with one stone and buy the Sentry ADS-B Receiver that works with the 4Flight app. It's a dual-band ADS-B receiver that works on both the 978 MHz and the 1090 MHz frequencies, and it has a built-in WAAS GPS receiver, which, by the way, is useful if you have a Wi-Fi-only iPad, since those don't have built-in GPS receivers. That gives you access to traffic information and the free FISB weather, which you can get without any kind of subscription. It also has a built-in AHARS, or Attitude Heading Reference System, which is something you'll need if you want synthetic vision, which we just, by the way, mentioned during the news segment, is now available in the iPhone version of 4Flight. And of course, Sentry also includes a carbon monoxide monitor and alarm, so you have protection against the dangers of carbon monoxide in the cockpit. Now, Sentry is portable and has an internal battery that lasts for up to 12 hours. And so if you want this ADS-B receiver, you can also get carbon monoxide detection included in the same package. The price for the Sentry, just $4.99. And again, I've included a link in the show notes so you can find the exact model on Amazon. And to get the show notes, just tap on the artwork on your smartphone's podcast player. Or if you're using a podcast player that doesn't display links in the show notes, just go out on the web and go to aviationnewstalk.com/88, and you'll see all the links from this show on our website. So just to recap, the 4 things you should know about carbon monoxide poisoning. 1, know the common symptoms of CO poisoning, including headache, dizziness, weakness, confusion, upset stomach, vomiting, and chest pain. Also, remember that the skin is pink or pale and that your lips could be bright red, and you might pass out or die from breathing in too much of the gas. 2, know that most common source of CO in planes is a faulty heating system. So if you suspect CO poisoning, shut off the cabin heat, open the windows to bring in fresh air, and land as soon as possible. 3, know that 43% of poisoned patients still have cognitive problems a year after their encounter. So do whatever you can to avoid encounters with carbon monoxide. And the best way to avoid encounters with carbon monoxide is, number 4, buy an electronic CO detector. After all, the life you save, it may be your own. Coming up next, lots of listener feedback and questions. One listener wants to know if there's a free app he can use in flight to get free weather from a portable ADS-B receiver. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Let's get to some listener feedback. This is an email from Brett in Kansas. He says, "Hey, Max, just want to let you know 2 ways in which we are promoting your podcast. During our VMC safety portion of our EAA meeting in Independence, Kansas, which he mentions is the same field as where the Cessna single-engine plant is, We play part of your audio on S-Turns. Also, I explained to the group what is and how to use podcasts. In addition, we posted a link to the podcast on our Facebook page. I encourage you to encourage others to do the same. So instead of telling a few people about your podcast, we tell dozens. Keep up the good work. By the way, I fly a 1947 Stinson 108-2 Voyager. Well, Brett, that's a great idea, and I hope listeners will go ahead and share portions of their podcast at different safety meetings that they may be having in their area. Here's an email from Daniel in Australia, and I received a similar one from Glenn. Daniel said, "Hi, Max. I was listening to your episode on short field landings and heard you talk about some differences we have flying in Australia. I had a few comments on that. Firstly, you mentioned that we have an AWIS, not an ATIS. Actually, we have both AWIS, Aerodrome Weather Information Service, and ATIS, Automatic Terminal Information Service. The ATIS is usually at controlled aerodromes and includes other operational information such as the active runway." And I explained to him, by the way, that we have a similar distinction in the U.S., except for us, it's AWAS and ATIS, and AWAS is generally at non-towered airports. He said, "You also mentioned the beep at the end of transmissions on the CTAF frequency at Orange Regional Airport. This is an AFRU, an Aerodrome Frequency Response Unit. The beep indicates that it has been less than 5 minutes since someone has transmitted on frequency. If you transmit when no one has used the CTAF for more than 5 minutes, it will respond with something like Orange CTAF. The beep is intended to help you check that you're on the correct frequency and transmitting and receiving correctly." So yes, David, I was guessing there was some type of local transmitter which was adding the beeps to the end of each transmission, but I never would have imagined that it also indicated how much time had passed since the last transmission. So thanks to you and Glenn for explaining that to me. Here's an email from John in Virginia. He said, "I particularly found your recent episode on the BFR very useful. I just completed my BFR, a Washington, D.C. area flyer flying around the SFRA. That's the Special Flight Rules area, as I recall. He says training is mandatory. For my BFR, a piece of trivia, actually here there are 8 things that you need on hand if you are ramp checked. In addition to the 7 you mentioned, one must also have the DC Special Flight Rules card." Okay, I totally forgotten that. There is an online course, by the way, which I have taken and explains exactly how to get in and out of the SFRA if you're flying in Washington, D.C. area. And I had forgotten that you get a card as a result of taking that course. Here's an email from Eric in California. "Just listened to your latest show and you talk about using handheld radios. One trick I learned from some online friends is to put a barrel connector on the number 2 Navcom radio antenna wire with an extra loop tucked under the panel. Then if you need, you can connect your handheld to it. Makes a great solution in an emergency." And yes, you know what, I recall years ago I had a Cessna T210 that I owned with a partner, and the prior owners had put a loop of coax in the front right on the panel that went from one connector to another, and all you had to do was disconnect one end of that coax off from the BNC connector and then connect it straight to the handheld. It worked great. Another solution, by the way, there are splitters available. I think Bendix King sells one for, I don't know, probably $150, $200. And if you get that installed, you don't have to disconnect the antennas because it uses a small cavity to isolate your transmitter from the other transmitters so they don't blow out each other's receivers. But anyway, all kinds of good solutions there. Here's an email from Bob in New Jersey, and I also received a similar one from Michael. Bob said, "Love the podcast. Just listened to episode 86 on my way into work and have to disagree." This, by the way, was our Black Friday sales show. He said, "Wi-Fi only iPad works great with an aftermarket GPS." He says he has one from Dual, and he uses that GPS with ForeFlight. And he says it's far less expensive than buying the LTE version of the iPad, both for the hardware and because you have no cell plan required. Well, just to correct you on that, no cell plan is required if you buy the LTE version either. But you raise a really excellent point. You know, Bob, I used to know that, and I had totally forgotten that if you have a Wi-Fi only iPad, you still can use it with Moving Map software and see your position. You just need to use a separate external GPS like the one you would get from Dual or Bad Elf or any of the folks that sell separate standalone GPS receivers. Now let's go to listener questions.
Hi, Max. This is Ben Davis. I appreciate and enjoy all the work you do here with Aviation News Talk. On episode 61, listener John Weiswasser asked about filing IFR flight plans, and you discussed why you typically do not file IFR plans on your long east-west cross-country flights. You discussed getting flight following during your flights, but didn't mention filing VFR flight plans. I was wondering if you file VFR flight plans and if you recommend filing them to your students. Nowadays, with the advent of so much technology in the cockpit and the possibility of flight following, I wonder the value and advantages or disadvantages of VFR flight plans. I have filed them, but I'm conflicted on the should I or shouldn't I question. What are your thoughts? Thank you.
Ben, great question. For folks who may not know, here in the U.S., VFR flight plans are optional. We don't have to do them, and they are only for search and rescue purposes. That's in contrast to Mexico, where I recall I had to always file a flight plan down there, even if I was VFR. So if your aircraft goes down and you want someone to start looking for you, well, having a VFR flight plan is a really good thing to have in place. Now, essentially, there's a three-step process involved. The first step is you have to file a VFR flight plan, which you can do by calling 800-WX-BRIEF or by filing online through services like 800WXBrief.com or the 4Flight app. The second step is that you open the flight plan, which you would usually do by calling on the radio either just before or just after you take off. Of course, you can also now open and close VFR flight plans directly from 4Flight in the File and Brief view. And then when you're close to your destination or soon after you've landed, you close your flight plan either over the radio, through 4Flight, or by calling 1-800-WX-BRIEF on the phone. So, yes, using VFR flight plans is a really good thing to do, especially if you want to get found. I just looked up the data from the Civil Air Patrol on how long it takes to find a downed aircraft, depending upon whether they were IFR, on a VFR flight plan, or had no flight plan at all. And it was pretty close to what I remembered. And the first time I saw these numbers, I remember thinking that when you go flying, just in case your aircraft were to go down, you should bring a really good book to read. Here are the numbers. If you filed an IFR flight plan, the average time to find you is 11.5 hours. Pretty surprising. I would have thought that was sooner. If you filed a VFR flight plan, the average time to find you is 18 hours. And if no flight plan was filed, well, the average time to find you is 62.6 hours. So that's more than 3 times as long as if you had filed a VFR flight plan. So if you want to be found, file a VFR flight plan. And as to what I do, well, Ben, I'm a little conflicted about answering that, but I'll go ahead and give you a truthful answer. Generally, when I move a Cirrus across the country, I fly relatively high, and I always get flight following. But there are times when we lose radio coverage with ATC, especially if we're down low trying to beat a strong headwind. And those are the times when, frankly, I'm at much greater risk because I haven't filed a VFR flight plan. Generally, I only file VFR flight plans if I'm flying a less capable aircraft, and I have some reason to believe that there's a good chance I won't be able to maintain radio coverage for the entire flight. But now that I've thought about it, I think I should start practice opening and closing flight plans in 4Flight, which I haven't done in the past, because I bet it's a lot easier than I think. It's probably easier than calling flight service on the radio. And you know how it is. When things are simple, us humans, like you and I, we are much more likely to actually do something. So yes, Ben, I should be filing VFR flight plans more often than I do, and I'm going to go ahead and practice doing it in 4Flight because, as I said, I suspect it's a little easier than calling flight service on the radio. And here's a email from Jim in Florida who writes, Max, love the podcast, except when I learn I've been doing something wrong for many years. Then he goes on and says, that's okay because my pilot buddies seem to have been doing something wrong themselves. He says, so listening to the Black Friday podcast, I fly a 1949 Cessna 170A steam gauge tail dragger. I have a transponder, so I'm sort of in the 20th century. I really like ADS-B weather and was wondering if there were some way to receive it without having to subscribe to an app. I plan my cross-country flights on AOPA and printed out like we used to do. Yep, I want the free weather for free. Well, Jim, I had to do a little bit of research on this because, yes, I think most people know if you buy a portable ADS-B receiver, you can pick up free weather from the government. But then the question is, how do you display that on your iPad or iPhone or whatever device you have in the airplane? And yes, most of the time, you're going to have to buy an app or subscribe to an app, and that's going to cost you money every year. I did find out, however, there is a solution for you. And that would be Flight Plan Go. Now, Flight Plan Go, that's FLT Plan Go. Now, that company was recently purchased by Garmin, but their app, for as far as I know, has been free. So you can go out to both on an Android phone or an iPhone or iPad, and you can search in the App Store for Flight Plan Go. So FLT PLAN, separate word, Go. Now, who knows what's going to happen in the future? I'm sure you have seen that when services are offered for free, at some point in time, things may change and they may not be free any longer. But as far as I know for now, Flight Plan Go is still free, so have at it. And by the way, I did look up to see which portable ADS-B receivers are supported. I don't want you to run off and buy one that won't work. Garmin lists several different portable receivers that are compatible with it. And the Garmin GDL50 is probably a good choice. That's $799, and that's available through Amazon. I'll go ahead and put a link in the show notes so that you can find that directly. And anybody else who wants to put together a little Christmas present for themselves can go out and get the GDL50 for $799, the free Flight Go app, and you're then going to have free ADS-B weather for the foreseeable future. And with that, let me encourage you to listen to bloopers at the end of this show. And also, if you have a question you'd like answered to the show, just click on the artwork in your podcast player, and you can find my contact information and a link where you can go and record a question from your smartphone. Or if you want to just send an email, go out to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page. I'd love to hear from you about just about anything. And if you think that someday you might be interested in buying a new or a slightly used Cirrus, please call me today. I can help arrange a free demo flight for you if you're thinking about a new Cirrus and help you understand the many factors, not all of which are obvious in buying a new versus a slightly used Cirrus. I specialize in all kinds of Cirrus and work with people around the world. Now, here's one favor I would like to ask for you. The most important way you can help this show is if you're not already subscribing and you just go out to the website occasionally and find this show, click on the subscribe button, especially if you're in, for example, Apple Podcasts, because whenever they see new clicks, people subscribing, that moves our ranking of the show up higher. That's really important. So take a moment today, think about one or two friends you think might enjoy the show, tell them about it, get them to subscribe in either Apple Podcast, or if they're just not that familiar with podcast, send them out to either the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store if they have an Android phone, and search in the App Store for Aviation News Talk. That's 3 separate words, and they'll be able to download our dedicated app, which is where you're also going to find a lot of the bonus content that I mentioned today that I've already uploaded. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. EAA from EAA.org. EAA says that pilots should regard non-FAA aircraft It'd be great if I could talk. Nationwide through December 9th, 2018. Applicants must be willing to work at any FAA AT facility. Yeah, easy for me to say. Officials with Colorado Parks and Wildlife are asking the public for help in identifying a pilot responsible for harassing a large herd of elk. Yeah, maybe that was elk. I'm not sure, but it looked like an elk.